Okay, we might just as well begin. For those of you who didn't get a syllabus last week, there is some up here. This is the same thing I passed out last week, so if you got it last week, don't worry about it. We've moved some students off the wait list into formal course enrollment. I noticed that there are still a couple of seats vacant for the Psychology 129 version of the course. So we'll finish that process this week. If you're still on the wait list and you still want to get into the class, make sure you go to the discussion section for which you're waitlisted, and we'll do what we can. We have to give preference to Psych and Cog Sci majors, and we have to give preference to seniors and juniors. Okay, that's just the way things are. Is there anything else I should be saying at the moment? Oh, good. All right, so let's talk about introspection, which is an old and valued technique in philosophy and psychology as well. And it's by virtue of introspection that we have the problem of consciousness to begin with. Remember that when Descartes looked into his own mind, what he said was he discovered that he was thinking. And by virtue of the fact that he discovered himself thinking, he reasoned to all sorts of other kinds of conclusions. A little while later, a couple centuries later, when William James goes to write his groundbreaking textbook of psychology, The Principles, a book that still bears reading today, he began by defining psychology as the science of mental life, by which he really meant conscious mental life, states of consciousness. And if anybody had any doubts about that, you find when James is talking about introspection, he says, the first thing we have to do is rely on introspection. James understood that there was an experimental psychology that used what he called brass instruments, and he taught his students all about that. But for him, nothing took the place of systematic introspection, looking into your own mind and discovering what you find there. And of course, what he says is, everyone agrees that when we look into our own minds, we find states of consciousness. And you can disagree about what consciousness is good for, you can disagree about whether it's good for anything, but you can't disagree about the fact that we find states of consciousness when we look into our own minds. The existence of such states never been doubted by any critic. So now, when we do that, when we follow James's prescription and look into the contents of our own minds, what do we find? Well, I don't know what you find, and I'll keep what I find to a secret, but we know what James found. And what James identified from looking into the contents of his own mind was what he called 5 characters, or what we would now call characteristics of consciousness, which are laid out here. The first of these is personal subjectivity, that thought tends to personal form. And by this, what James means simply is that every mental state is experienced as our mental state. When I think something, I experience myself as thinking it. When I feel or want something, I experience myself as feeling it or wanting it. I don't experience your thoughts and feelings, and you don't experience mine. So that in a very real sense, a point that I'll try to come back to later in the course, that it's not just that feelings and thoughts exist, but that my thoughts and my feelings exist. Every state of consciousness being owned. The second point here is that thought is in constant change. Thought is James's generic term for consciousness. So we just don't hang on to thoughts and kind of keep them unmodified in consciousness, if only because once you've had a thought, you know you've had that thought, and you're thinking about the thought you just had. Or you're thinking about the thought you just had. Whatever it is, there's always some kind of mobility in states of consciousness, so that we never get the same bodily sensation twice. I can look at my computer all the time. It's the same computer, but my experience of that computer is going to be different each time. The fact that thought is in constant change brings us to the next feature that James discovered in consciousness, which is that consciousness is continuous from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep at night, unless you get some certain kind of head injury or you take a nap or whatever. But for all intents and purposes, your state of consciousness is not a bunch of discrete little units or states of consciousness, but rather each one is flowing into the other in some kind of continuous fashion. And it's that property of consciousness that gives James his metaphor, which was not original with James, but which he popularized, of the stream of thought or the stream of consciousness, which you never step into quite the same stream twice. And then finally, a point I'll come back to a little bit later today, which is that we don't have thoughts in the abstract, okay? At least not for James, we don't have thoughts in the abstract. In the first place, we know that we have these thoughts. There's a self-reflective quality to consciousness that's important. But also, we're conscious of things. You're conscious of your eyes closing. You're conscious of your stomach growling. You're conscious of what I'm saying here with any luck at all. You're conscious of your friend's Facebook update, which you're reading now on your laptop screen. You're always conscious of something, right? You're not conscious in the abstract. Now, that was what James thought, and later on when we talk about meditation, we'll have to entertain the possibility that there's something like pure consciousness, okay? That you can just be conscious without being conscious of any particular thing, but we're not there yet, not by a long shot. Okay, so those are Kant's 5 states of the 5 characteristics of consciousness: personal subjectivity, constant change, continuity through that constant change, that there's a kind of aboutness. Consciousness is always about something else, what the philosophers call intentionality, a point I'll come back to a little bit later. And then finally, the one that I hadn't gotten to yet is that we're always conscious of some things and ignoring something else. We're not conscious of everything all at once, not even everything that's in our sensory the fields, but consciousness is selective. It's always interested more in one part of its object than in another, and welcomes and rejects or chooses all the while it thinks, so that we're always paying attention to one part of the environment as opposed to another, one part of an object as opposed to another. This selectivity of consciousness is an important property because it allows us to link consciousness with attention, a point, again, I'll come back to in a couple of weeks when we take up attention directly. Okay, so that's what James found when he looked into his own mind. He found various states of consciousness. The next question ought to be, well, what kinds of states of consciousness are there? And we can begin with an earlier philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who, when he considered this problem, asserted that there are 3 absolutely irreducible faculties of mind: knowledge, feeling, and desire. That those are the 3 basic categories of mental states, the 3 basic categories of consciousness. And by irreducible, what he meant was, that's it. You've got knowledge, you got feeling, you got desire. There's nothing underneath those in the first place. There's nothing more atomistic, if you will, than that. And the other point that Kant meant about this was that you couldn't reduce the one to the other. You can't take a feeling state, an emotional state, and turn it somehow into belief. Another proposition that was challenged by later cognitive psychology. But this aphorism from Kant, that there are 3 irreducible states of mind: knowledge, feeling, and desire, I think gives us a good first approximation of what it is that we find when we look into the contents of our own mind. Right now, you know you're in this classroom listening to me blather on. You're feeling bad that your girlfriend dumped you last night, and you want desperately to go to lunch, okay? That's it. Those are the kinds of things that we have in our states of consciousness. In modern translation, we have what Ernest Hilgard, Jack Hilgard, late psychologist at Stanford, called the trilogy of mind of cognition, emotion, and motivation. Knowledge, feeling, and desire. And in this course, and in most of psychology, what gets emphasized a lot is our states of cognition. We have whole courses on sensation and perception and memory and thinking and all of that kind of stuff. Those are all cognitive states. There are varieties of states of knowing the world. More recently, psychology has gotten more interested again in emotional states, the problems of feeling and affect and mood, and still to come really is an interest, revived interest in motivational states, states of desire having to do with people's needs and wants and goals. But this trilogy of mind, knowledge, feeling, and desire, cognition, emotion, and motivation, are at the very top level what we seem to find when we look into the contents of our own minds and try to figure out what kinds of states of consciousness we find there. The philosophers often talk about this as in terms of the problem of qualia. And usually in philosophy and in cognitive science, these distinctive states of mind are characterized with this term qualia. The singular is quale, Q-U-A-L-E, which simply means that we have, passing through our minds, various kinds of states that are each qualitatively different from each other. And this term qualia refers to these different subjective qualities of conscious experience. And these qualia are best illustrated by and really modeled on the various kinds of sensory modalities. So to see something is different, qualitatively different than it is to hear something. To taste something is qualitatively different from smelling something. And similarly, to see yellow as opposed to red or blue as opposed to green, those are qualitatively different kinds of mental states. And you can, by analogy, look at the various other kinds of sensory modalities as well. To taste sweet is somehow qualitatively different from the taste of sour. Now, in the next lecture on Wednesday, we'll talk more about this and try to figure out what the basic qualities of each of these sensory experiences are. But the general idea here is that the philosophical idea of qualia, that when we look into our own minds, we find qualitative states of various kinds, states that differ in kind from each other, that's where the study of consciousness begins. Dan Dennett, a philosopher who actually doesn't have much use for the whole notion of qualia, I think nevertheless offered a succinct definition of what we mean by qualia in terms of a set of 4 properties. The first of these is that qualia are somehow ineffable. That is to say, you can't really describe what it's like to experience one of these qualias. Anybody want to try describing what it's like to see red?